Welcome back to the DSR Ghostwriting Podcast, episode number 2. In this podcast, I want to quickly, in a much more abbreviated fashion than the last podcast, go over another practical matter for freelancers, small business owners, etc. This level of business that are looking for a web hosting package. The last episode we covered the rather obscure niche issue of looking for sound cancelling headphones because, as I disclosed, I have been living next to a construction site for the past 10 months. This is, I'm sure, an issue that pretty much every freelancer is going to run into. So I see what a lot of people are thinking in terms of, creating a web presence. There's a lot of people deliberating in the group, people that, don't have such a technical background. The easiest option for people, if you're looking to build out a website for your freelance, for your writing business, is to, firstly, people are going to need a domain name. So there's two components to, putting something out on the internet. Firstly, there's a domain name, a URL, i.e. yourwebsite.com. There's a debate. You can discuss the top level domain, the TLD, the last three letters, weather.com, stuttering supreme agency. I've noticed is growing a lot in popularity. That's an SEO debate. From what I've read recently, .com, some people may see it as more prestigious. I operate my main prospecting website now on a .com because it's targeted to an international audience. I have one Israeli domain .co.il. I've previously owned Irish domains.ie, and I have a couple of really obscure ones, including .wedding for my wedding. That's danandhan.wedding. Quick plug for it. And I had a .world once. What I will say is with the newer TLDs, so the process of creating top level domains which involves ICANN, is not that simplistic. So everything doesn't exist. A lot exists, but you don't have, for example, I'm looking at my coffee cup here. I don't have there. You can't buy a website currently, danielrosehill.coffeecup. That TLD hasn't been provisioned yet. The process is that in rough parameters, that things are approved. But I have noticed that I have run into difficulties where stuff like online forums has rejected my .wedding domain and the .world domain. So I would say just go for unless you have a specific reason not to use a .com, don't use a .com. If you want to brand your website to a specific geography, i.e. you're focused on serving UK, you're a British-based business focused on serving UK customers, you may want to operate a .co.uk. You may want to have a .co.uk that forwards to a .com and use that in your marketing collateral. You may want to use a .co.uk in parallel to a .com and do split routing of the inbound traffic depending where it originates from. There's a lot of complicated things you can do, but let's just say step one is you've picked up a .com website. Easiest route to go for people. And by the way, I'm picking this topic for this episode because I've just dealt with the process of moving hosting provider twice actually in the last 6 months. So I have had a chance to evaluate the market and just explain to people exactly what their options are. The most simple thing you can do is to buy your domain, as I said. You can even use one of these integrated providers where they will, like for example, Wix, where they'll let you buy the domain through them, so they'll act as a domain registrar and let you and host your website and give you a drag and drop editor. That's the easy approach. If you want something based on a template where you're going to sacrifice control, you're going to sacrifice just the ability to make advanced configurations to your website if you take this approach. Because, as I said, there are two components for a website, and the user sees one. You go onto a website and it loads in your browser and everything is great. There's a website and there's hosting. So the website has to exist somewhere. The website is just a alphanumeric combination that's easy to remember. That's a shortcut for a public IP address. That's what an actual domain name is in reality. People couldn't remember 193.64. blah blah blah, so they remembered dsrghostwriting.com. That's a domain name and that's all it is. But that actual website, which is a series of files and databases, has to be stored somewhere. So just so you have your computer, the website is stored on a server, and renting a server to host your website on is an industry called hosting, web hosting. You may not need these technical details, so feel free to skip forward a few minutes and I'll explain the various hosting options one can take. Once you have that, technically it's possible to host a website on your own computer, on a laptop. If the laptop is running 24/7, if you have port forwarding to allow the outside world, to bypass the typical firewall setup in a local home network. If your ISP allows that, you can do that. I have even done that myself as an experiment, but you're limited by, it's not desirable. The local home networks are configured for primarily downlink. You're a user downloading stuff from the internet. Even when you're streaming, you're downloading in real time. When you're hosting a website, you're uploading to the internet and then the user is downloading. So you can do it if you want to learn about networking. It's a cool experiment. Look up port forwarding. Even if your ISP and router doesn't allow you to port forward, there's various workarounds, but that's not really an option. But I'm just, for the sake of completeness, I'm putting it in there. So the most typical hosting option besides these all-in-one providers which bundle hosting along with other services is something called shared hosting. Shared hosting is the entry level to the world of hosting. So go to Bluehost, GoDaddy offer hosting as well. These are like monoliths within the hosting industry. Shared hosting essentially bundles a ton of websites onto one physical server in a data center. So it's your website and then hundreds of other websites. You're not guaranteed resources in terms of CPU access, that kind of thing. In other words, the performance it's not suited. If you have low level traffic, and that's it, and you've got one website, shared hosting is a great choice. The problem becomes when you start getting significant amount of traffic. You could find you're throttled. Throttling means your hosting provider essentially sees that your website is consuming too much bandwidth on the server. Too many people are accessing it at one time, and therefore they're going to restrict, in order to not impair the performance of other websites on that same shared server. They're going to restrict your resource allocation, which is going to make your website load like a snail. There's various other factors from a more technical standpoint. With shared hosting, it's unusual, although not, I personally had it to have root access. In other words, SSH access, sorry, you actually get to log in on the command line to the server and make your own changes. But typically that's, if that exists, it's a plus. You certainly don't typically, it's a managed server. So you're getting a configuration. The server could be an Ubuntu server or a Debian server, and the hosting company is managing that. So if you want to get under the hood technically and make changes and add packages and upgrade the PHP version and things like this, shared hosting is not your option. However, if it's one website, stick it on. Just be aware that it's not a scale proof solution, i.e. if your website suddenly starts getting a lot of traffic, you're going to run into difficulties. So typically the next thing people think of, let me tell you about my story. So I recently got hacked on a large scale. There's a malware, former Russian malware called, I've actually even forgotten the name. It was like some weird name. And there was a WordPress website on my shared hosting, which had about something like 14 websites. Too many websites to have on a shared hosting. It just wasn't on my priority list to tackle. One of the websites got infected with malware. There was an outdated theme. It was a website that I was managing for somebody else. Baba Yaga, I think, was a malware. It's particularly virulent strain of malware that cybersecurity researchers found originated in Russia and essentially even disables, it propagates spam. So I looked at one of my websites and noticed there was just a ton of Korean writing and links for American football jerseys. So I knew something was up straight away. With shared hosting, when you have, just to explain firstly why why this incident forced me to upgrade my own hosting. So one website got attacked. So there was a vulnerability, a hacker got in, corrupted the databases, the MySQL, and then that kind of spread stuff throughout the website, and every page was littered with spam. I tried to remedy it myself, removing the malware. You can see the WordPress files were corrupted. Using a plugin called WordFence, you could see there's fake WordPress files being created, decoy files, complete mess. And that was one problem. The greater problem happened when it spread between all the different websites in my account, and I had just moved to this host, which I've since learned is a period of vulnerability for your websites when the DNS is repropagating throughout the internet. So because there wasn't a backup, I didn't have a backup for my old host, and I didn't realize there was no backup included in this package that I'd simply just subscribed to. I was in limbo land and took the websites I could, but basically in shared hosting, if you have multiple websites, important to realize that your websites are not very well isolated. They're all part of the same file directory essentially. So this is called caging. Sorry, this is all. I'm not a web hosting expert, but I know enough to tell you this basic information. So caging is, the isolation between the files. So another thing about shared hosting is if you are operating multiple websites on it, as many people on these packages do, it's important to keep all. If you're using a open source, a script like WordPress that is very actively targeted by hackers, important to keep everything updated, themes, plugins. Run a proper security plugin such as WordFence, enable brute force protection, do all this stuff, and make sure you have backups. That's another thing. I have always put a huge emphasis on backups. I took my eye off the target for a few months when I moved to a new host, and my first concern was just making sure stuff was set up. I was really shocked to see there wasn't any backup. I was with a host called SiteGround, which I do highly recommend for shared hosting. And I moved to a different provider, which will remain unnamed because I'm so unhappy with them. I don't want to defame them publicly. So that's just another thing to be aware about shared hosting. Typically, the next tier up people think about is VPS. So if you've ever used a virtual machine on your computer, which is, virtualization allows you to create an operating system that acts and feels like a real bare metal installation, except it really is just a resource, a program on your actual operating system. So if you've used a VM, you use something like VMware, and again, I know I'm speaking more to the kind of more technical audience here. If you haven't used one of these, I just explained basically what they are. I use Linux, and I tend to virtualize Windows a lot for various reviews I have to do for clients. Someone wants me to test out a Windows software, or I've never actually virtualized Mac. I've done Android quite a bit. So yeah, I use VMware or VirtualBox, Oracle's VirtualBox, quite a bit. So that's basically what a VPS is. It's a virtual server. You're not getting an actual dedicated server, but you're getting a virtual machine on a dedicated server, which you have effectively on a managed. There's managed VPS and unmanaged VPS. But with all the advantages of actually having it's an analogous to a virtual machine and a real machine in the desktop computing world. So that's that. I looked into VPS for a bit. There's certainly a big cost jump from shared hosting to VPS, but you are getting guaranteed resource allocation. And if you're managing the VPS yourself, you really get to control very granularly the state of the actual server. However, there is another way, and let me just round this off by saying, of course, the top tier from this side. I'm not going to get into stuff like AWS because for the self-employed freelance market, I don't think this is a bit too far. AWS being Amazon Web Services. Of course, the top of this is a dedicated server where you actually rent a physical server in some hosting company's data center. and you have full access to it. You're not just having a virtual machine, you're having an actual machine itself, a bare metal machine, the physical thing. So that was fine and dandy. I knew that it was time to move out of shared hosting. Little intimidated by VPS, especially the ones that were really had to be self-managed. Looking potentially at a somewhat infected code base in the sense that I wasn't completely sure that all my websites were okay. I literally didn't sleep for 2 weeks during this process, by the way. I had to rebuild about 6 websites completely from scratch. It was a huge thing. So I was just trying to get myself up and running ASAP, just to get back in business. So there's a cool thing I'm telling you about called reseller hosting. And that's kind of why I'm even making this podcast, because I called it the hidden gem of the hosting world. And I'm not sure I know there are some people that share my view on this, because you'll certainly see it listed on the bigger hosting providers, but often it's on a landing page not targeted towards the business market and not for consumers. So I got some great advice from some people who really, really work in the hosting industry, really know their stuff. And if it wasn't for that, I probably wouldn't have thought of it. They told me, given my needs, don't go for VPS, go for reseller. Reseller basically allows you to become a hosting company. So you get, when you're hosting your websites, and if you don't go down the Wix approach, and I encourage people not to, you're probably going to see something called cPanel. So cPanel is like a administration console. There's another one called Plex, but cPanel is just about the biggest one for managing your website in a complete manner. So everything from Softaculous for single click installation of scripts, configuring email addresses, configuring forwarders, changing DNS records, the whole shebang. Cron access, adding FTP accounts, leading FTP accounts, setting up cron jobs. You can do everything within cPanel. It gives you all these little utilities essentially. When you're looking at reseller hosting, you get a ton of cPanel. So let's say I have 100. I can host 100 properties in my reseller hosting package, with a website called hostforgeeks.com. Now I cannot believe how insanely good value this is. I used to pay SiteGround something like $150, $200. Again, I'm not clear on the figures. I didn't look at it as a expense to economize on. It's just it is what it is. I was looking for someone else because I didn't really fit into their tiers anymore. I.e. my needs had exceeded what they offered. But the difference between that and what I'm paying Host for Geeks for an annual subscription of about $250 is like night and day. I'm getting 100 cPanel accounts, each with an unlimited inode limit. Inodes, you want to pay attention to these in shared hosting if you do start bundling on accounts. It's the number of files and folders in your overall file structure. Okay, so every time you add a directory and add a file, that's another inode. The inode count limit can be as low as 300,000 or 600,000 inodes, and I have run into inode creation problems. So when you consider that you've got a 100 cPanel accounts, unlimited inodes, it boggles my mind how much digital real estate I can actually host on this reseller account. I have something called WHM, which is like the super cPanel, if you want to think about it like that. It manages all the cPanels, and it's really, really incredible. The beauty is that because it's intended for actual hosting companies. So I don't intend to get into the hosting business, but I could tell my friend, you want to host your website with me? No problem. I'll charge you $100 a year. Here's $50. I could charge them $30 a year because the whole package is so cheap. It's ridiculous, and still make a profit. As I said, I'm a writer, not a hosting company. And yeah, you get access to this. And my friend would have access, cPanel access, manages websites, and I could send him an annual invoice, and that's it. He would be totally set up. So the beauty is that when I was talking about stuff like caging earlier, and the event that one website becomes corrupted and it infects all your other websites on the account, that's not really a concern on reseller hosting, because each website The inconvenience is that if you want to you're quickly administrating a bunch of websites, you do need to jump around into the different cPanels in order to change, whatever whatever you're working on. Add an email here, change a DNS record here, blah blah blah. Personally, no comparison. The final thing I will say while we're on the topic of hosting, is I recommend also using a service called Cloudflare. Cloudflare kind of sits between, so I'm managing my domains in a few different places because it's kind of a mess at this point. I have managed some domains for family members, have my own domains, another one for other people. They're in a few different registrars, and that's where they are. With Cloudflare, you can point the name servers. It's kind of an intermediary between your website and the user. So what I do is I point my name servers in my various registrars onto Cloudflare, and then within Cloudflare gives me full DNS management. I'm sorry, I'm getting very technical again, but and I'm sure enough people will be able to bear with me, or I hope so, to make it through this. In Cloudflare, I have full DNS management. I can create zone records for everything, and that basically means that like I go onto Cloudflare and I can manage everything. I can say that a website's under attack, so that'll prevent traffic from actually hitting the website. I can create firewall rules. I can enforce different. I can even enforce redirects and force HTTP traffic onto HTTPS. Cloudflare is really, really cool, and it's another thing that a lot of people think of it just for speed as a CDN and improving the speed of their websites. Certainly, obviously, that's valid, but I would say if you do have your website scattered over a few different registrars, and you want to be able to manage stuff centrally, it's really, and you can always go back, just change the name servers from the Cloudflare name servers to the ones on your hosting provider, and you'll be able to manage stuff directly wherever that website's being hosted. I think it's beautiful. I go into Cloudflare, put up two-factor authentication in Cloudflare, because once you're centralizing resources like that, you're narrowing the attack surface. So it's a bit riskier, but I encourage every webmaster to do it. So I hope that this overview of the web hosting options for small business owners has been helpful. To conclude, if you're really a nutcase, you can host your website yourself. The typical entry level is shared hosting. The typical next step up is VPS hosting, which is a virtual private server, can be managed or unmanaged, and then all the way up to dedicated server and stuff like AWS. However, I think reseller hosting, which in that schematic is somewhere between shared hosting and VPS. I think it is the hidden gem of the hosting world. I've heard that hosting providers are phasing out this kind of distributed reseller model of web hosting sales. I hope that's not the case, because I think for what I'm receiving for hostforgeeks.com for my $240 a year is still mind blowing. I still can't believe I can host like 80 more websites and on pretty much unlimited infrastructure on each. And that's what there is. So good luck setting up your website. Daniel, DSR Ghostwriting.com. There's a contact form there if you'd like to be in contact. I can probably help with basic questions. Beyond that, I encourage you to speak to an IT professional in order to develop the website most suitable to your needs. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.